welcome to Brain Chat. I'm Dr. Mitzi Joy Williams, your board-certified neurologist and MS specialist, and my mission is to engage, educate, and empower those affected by MS to become an active part of their healthcare team. Here on Brain Chat, we'll be discussing all things MS, health and wellness, advocacy, and we'll even throw a little bit of music and music therapy in there as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next episode. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Brain Chat. It's Dr. Mitzi, the nerdy neurologist, and I am so excited to be with you all for another episode where we are learning more about MS and more about what's next in treatment. So this episode I'm especially excited about because I've got two amazing colleagues with me, and we are going to get into some of the nitty-gritty about what is on the horizon in the field of treatment for MS. First, we'd like to thank our sponsor, the National MS Society, and thank you to all of you for tuning in and watching this episode or listening to it wherever you may be listening. You know how we do on Brain Chat. Log into the chat. Let us know where you are viewing us from. I bid you greetings from Atlanta, Georgia, where the heat is on. It is officially summer, even though it's not quite summer yet, but it's getting hot here. So I hope you guys are staying cool. And let's go ahead and get into our topic. All right. So I've got two amazing folks with me tonight. We've got Dr. Barry Singer, who is the director of the MS Center for Innovation Care at Missouri Baptist Medical Center. And then we've also got Dr. Daniel Bhandari, who is the director of the MS Center of California Research Group in Laguna Hills, California. Well, welcome to Brain Chat, my friends.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Mitzi, for inviting us on.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, listen, I know I've got two of the top experts here. And so I'm going to pick your brains and we are going to educate this audience about what's new and what's on the horizon. I know that you probably get the same questions in clinic that I do after the end of a visit. Hey, Dr. Mitzi, what's new? What's coming up? Is there something that's going to cure my MS? And I'm like, not yet, but there's a lot of really exciting things that we have in research, some in very early research, but we want to get into it. But before we get started, whenever someone comes on Brain Chat, I love to hear your story about how you got interested in the field of multiple sclerosis. And we'll start with you, Dr. Bhandari.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having us in here. And so to make it short, neurology was not where I was supposed to be. I was supposed to be a cardiologist. And in medical school, one of my professors actually asked me the question because I asked a lot of neurology questions, my neuroscience, and he goes, "What are you going into?" I said, "Cardiology." And I remember he said, "I don't think so." And I remember I told him why, and he said, "Come and do some research with me. And then if at the end you want to still be a cardiologist, I'll give you the best letter." And at the end of that 6 months of research with him, I decided to be a neurologist. My background, actually, before I go to medical school, I got my master's degree in immunology also. So I was teaching immunology. So that made it actually extremely viable for me to do multiple sclerosis and immunology as a part of it. Not to also mention I have family members with multiple sclerosis as well. So all of those came together and made me very intrigued and interested. But more than anything else are also the patient themselves, which I believe they're fantastic within the age and the categories that they want to learn and they want to do something. And you see the fruit of your labors with them. And those are the reasons that I became an MS doctor.
Amazing. Perfect storm. And we're so glad you did. I mean, you know, shout out to all the amazing cardiologists, but we're so glad you joined the neurology team. What about you, Dr. Singer?
Well, I got interested in neurology probably as a kid because my grandmother had Parkinson's disease, and I ended up going to work with that neurologist later in life. But I went to Duke, and during college, I got interested in psychology and the brain, and then took actually some immunology in college. So kind of understanding these complex systems, and but it was really in med school when I started when I was at Columbia in New York, where I started seeing young patients struggling with MS, and I realized that we were going to be able to make a lot of progress because of how much we were learning about the immune system, and panned out.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I tell everyone I did not have a third year neurology rotation. So I took a leap of faith and filled out my application for residency before I ever saw a neurology patient. And it worked out well for me.
Wow.
So
Wow, that's scary. You must have really hated all the other fields.
I'm
I was
telling
gonna
you,
say,
I'm telling you, I really did. I
you're
really
that
did.
bad.
I was like, fingers crossed, we're taking the leap. And it turned out to be
It
good for me.
worked. It worked.
Absolutely, it works. Okay, so one of the things I think, one of the reasons I love hearing people's stories is because everybody to me who treats MS is passionate about it, right? You don't go into neuroimmunology if you don't really care about the patients and also care about the science. So it's been really exciting to see how the treatment has changed so drastically over the past 20 years, like even over the past 10 years. It's just been amazing. And one of the reasons I did go into the field of MS was because I had a sense that where we started, back in the 2000s was going to be totally different in 10 or 15 or 20 years, and that we were going to have a lot more things in our armamentarium, so to speak, to treat this disease. So let's kind of take a little walk down, memory lane. I'll start with you, Dr. Bendari. Tell us a little bit about kind of the history of treatments for MS, kind of where we started. I think people don't really understand that treatments, we just had a first FDA approved treatment in 1993. So I think people don't really understand how recent it's been that treatments have developed for MS and kind of how rapid that's
Yeah,
evolved over the past, couple decades.
absolutely. It's so interesting because right before here this morning, I actually gave a virtual talk to annual California Neurological Society because they have their meeting right now going on.
Mhm.
And the biggest element for them was this lifespan of MS treatment. And I had a
Yeah.
slide in there that I showed from 1993 all the way to 2024. When you think about it, 30 years of management of multiple sclerosis, how far we have come. I actually started my career with the existence when I was doing my fellowship at USC with the existence of three medications in the market, Betaseron,
Mhm.
Avonex, and Copaxone.
Mhm.
And at the time, this was the best we could do. But when you
Mhm.
think about this thing, and when your audience think about this thing, and going back prior to 1993, 94, the only thing we would do for these patients is, sorry, Mrs. Johnson, you have multiple sclerosis. There's nothing I can give you. Come back when you have the next attack, and I'm going to give you some steroids, for example.
Mhm.
With the availability of Betaseron as one of the first medication, which originally, as you all know, it was not really available. It was on lottery basis. So I would
Mhm.
put the name of three patients in a hat, and one of them would get the medication for the first couple of years. And unfortunately, after that, they started actually making the medication and became available. And then glatiramer acetate or Copaxone, and then after that, other interferons like Avonex and Rebif came out in the market. This evolution over the past 30 years has took us through such a great road, as you all know. And this
Mhm.
road has allowed us not only to meet some of the unmet needs that we've had. For example, there were more advanced or disease progressed patients that we saw in 1990s and early 2000, and there was nothing to give them. When natalizumab came out in the market, it was more like originally God-given gift to us. And
Mhm.
that is what allowed us to use a higher efficacy, first higher efficacy medications in the market. And after that, the biggest question I always would get asked, same as you guys, is Dr. Banderi, when is the pill coming out? And I would always tell
When
them
is the
tomorrow
pill
morning.
coming?
I always would tell them tomorrow morning at 7:30. Come on, line up. So the reality is, existence of the oral medication also made a difference in that part. Why? Because it allowed the patient to comfortably able to take medication. But I think the biggest advances that we probably have seen, and we're still going to continue seeing, it is high efficacy medications that we have had in the past probably 5 to 10 years, including B cell inhibitors, including the cladribines of the world, including multiple other medication that comes out, and also some of the new generation drugs that are being worked up right now, which I'm sure we'll tag on and talk about those things. This evolution that I have seen has made a tremendous difference. And let me tell you, one of the biggest impact that I probably have seen, I've been practicing for about 25 years as a MS doctor, is that I rarely see any of my MS patient that has been diagnosed in the past 10 to 15 years that's going to need an assistive device, hopefully. And that is probably one of the biggest things that I have seen. Why? Because there was a time I used to do patient educational programs about 25 years ago, and the first three row of the auditorium were all wheelchair bound patients,
Mm.
always. And today, you rarely see people need assistive device, especially if they were diagnosed early, treated early, and they're on good medication and treatment, and they're doing other things that they need to do, including physical therapy, exercise, and all the other things. But I
Mm.
think this evolution, which is still continuum and it's
Right.
ongoing, is going to make a huge difference in the quality of life of the patients.
Excellent. I mean, so many amazing and great things that you said in that. I want to talk about Dr. Singer. I want you to talk a little bit about our understanding of the targets with MS, kind of 50,000 foot view, because originally, the way we were treating MS, we were modifying the immune system. Then we started, depleting, first everything was about T cells. Now we know that B cells are affected. Now we're looking at all different kind of cells. Talk to us a little bit about kind of how our understanding has changed and how we're finding new targets or avenues or pathways to treat MS and how that's evolved with our different treatments over the past couple decades.
Yeah, I mean, it's dramatically changed. Let's see. I mean, when we think about the first generation, it was these medications that kind of modify the immune system. They change it, but they didn't really make you immunosuppressed. The good news is when we use these medications, we were not knocking out part of the immune system. Patients weren't at increased risk of serious infections. But they only prevented about a third of the attacks. So they did affect the immune system, but didn't deplete it. And over time, we've got much more targeted treatments. One of the first oral medications that was involved in the clinical trials of Gilenya or fingolimod is, but what it basically does is trap certain white blood cells and lymph nodes and prevents them from attacking the brain and spinal cord. Interestingly, the same approach is now being used in ulcerative colitis to prevent the immune system from attacking the gut instead of the brain. So we started looking at new mechanisms of how we can try to prevent immune attack. Another medication, big class of medications called fumarates. So people know Tecfidera and dimethylfumarate and Vumerity. And these drugs also prevent, they have anti-inflammatory properties as well as properties that are antioxidant. So, and then we have another oral medication called cladribine or Mavenclad that kind of resets the immune system, knocks the immune system down and reboots. Similar to a more robust IV treatment that we also have called Lemtrada, which knocks down the immune system and reboots the immune system. So you're not chronically immunosuppressed. So we start looking at different approaches over time to really revolutionize how we treat the disease. I think the biggest breakthrough really came out in 2017. And as you mentioned, we originally had these drugs that were targeting primarily the T cells. Why we thought the T cells are a type of white blood cell called lymphocytes, and so are the B cells. But T cells seem to be the target. And that's because in the animal model of MS, when you take T cells from one animal and you put them in another animal, you can induce the disease. You can create the MS version in the animal model. So transferring the T cells seem to do it. So we're like, oh, the T cells must be the player. But now we knock out the B cells and you can get incredible disease control. Many of our old drugs prevent 80% of the spots on the brain or lesions. And these new drugs that knock out the B cells can be up to 97% more effective. So we do see the advent of these B cell therapies. And now we have 3 that are FDA approved, and it's really changed how we're treating MS. And frankly, up to about 40% of people with MS are now taking them in the US.
Yeah. I mean, I get goosebumps. I get excited, even though like I've lived through a lot of it, because I mean, it's just so amazing what has been accomplished and our understanding continues to evolve. And the nerd in me gets so excited when I think about the immune system and how we're able to more effectively treat our patients and help them to live, as regular and as normal lives as possible.
It was really a struggle, Mitzi, back in the day, because people were on the shots, and it was really tough. A lot of patients, a lot of the interferons can cause flu-like symptoms and depression.
Yeah.
It was really a struggle for a lot of people to take their medication. Some patients are still on them and doing amazingly well, but it was very hard back in those days. So I think what we see is people are able to adhere to their treatment better. And frankly, MS is getting pretty boring to treat.
I love boring, but I remember when we used to give people drug holidays, we'd be like, okay, all right, you're sick of being sick with the shots. Let's just give you a break for like a month and let's come back and try it again, because we had to do something to kind of, give people a little bit of relief from some of those symptoms.
Think about it. The fact that a lot of patients, when you used to do all these injectable medications, When Copaxone was a daily injections, or Betaseron every other day injection. One of the key things that they would come and say is that this disease is never out of my mind. Is that every afternoon that I pull a medication out of a refrigerator, it reminds me of this. It reminds me of the disease. So psychologically, not just biochemically, psychologically, it was playing a role with them. Now, and also the other thing that I think Barry illustrated that also is that the compliance was not very high in this thing. I mean, I remember I used to ask the patient rather than, "Are you doing your medications all the time?" I would say, "How many injections did you miss last month?" That kind of thing. Which with the new generation medication, especially with the IV infusible medications or the high efficacy oral medications, the compliance is almost 100% on these people. They come to the infusion center, they get infused, or they take their medication short period of time, and yet at the same time, not only the efficacy of the drug is higher, but the patient themselves, the compliance is higher. So collectively together, their quality of life is better, and at the same time, between treatment to treatment, sometimes they don't have to be worried about things. They can travel, they can vacation, they can do all the other things that they want to do. I think at the end of the day, MS is going to be looked at similar to diabetes. Think about it. For diabetes, there was a time that it was a big bad monster in there, and now people have tiny pump attached to them, and they go on the cruises and they do everything they want, and their sugar level is controlled, and they doesn't really affect their life, and they live in a normal life. So MS, hopefully, at some point, will become the similar kind of thing. That yes, we may not have 100% cure for it, but we can make the quality of life sort of near that, to the point that you don't have to be bothered by it as much.
Yeah. And that's what I tell people, in the clinic, when they say there's no cure, my first response is always, name me 5 diseases we have a cure for. And I still haven't gotten that in 20 years. Nobody's been able to name it.
Hepatitis C.
But that's it, right? But not 5.
Hepatitis is the only thing that we have.
Not 5. Measles used to be cured, but now that was back. But I say
we manage. We can take care of.
That's true. Listen, come on, Barry. Don't mess up my analogy here. Now you know what I mean. So, I tell people we manage it, right? Just like we manage other chronic conditions, and now we really have the tools to be able to do that. Before we go into new medications, though, I do want to pause because, you mentioned something, Dan, about when natalizumab came out. We used to have this concept of if somebody had really bad MS, we would bring out the big guns, right? So we would use a certain type of medication if your MS was relatively mild, but if you had bad MS and we put you on this medication, this meant you were really in trouble. Let's talk for a second about how our paradigm has shifted to now we want to give you the big guns early so we can try to get it under control as quickly as possible versus kind of that escalation model that we used to use, maybe 10 years ago before we had so many options. Whoever wants to go first.
Unfortunately, the part of this was related to the misnotion of the fact that these diseases could be escalatedly controlled in that part. That was one misnomer that we most of us had at that time. The other part of it, unfortunately, falls onto the fact that the insurance company would not allow you to use that big gun at the beginning that you wanted to, unless you have tried. And they call this step process that it came into it. And you all have had this scenario, and still sometimes it goes on that if I want to start a patient on a high efficacy medication, I still have to justify, write appeal letters, which we do. At the end of the day, I believe we run the show. We are the ones who make the decision with the patient for them and be able to manage them, not the insurance companies. And time after time, no matter how of a dead end you hit, you're going to still find a way to justify the fact that for this reason I want this patient to be on high efficacy medication. But overall, I have to say I agree. The paradigm shift that took place probably not that long ago made us believe of the fact that this escalation process may actually delay the proper treatment for this patient. So we're increasing the progression and activity of this patient, and therefore their quality of life is going to change. Versus if we are able to use the high efficacy medication for them early on, we can control the disease so basically early on, and based on that, the management of the disease, the progression of the disease especially, going to be much less into that it comes. And that has been proven through multiple clinical trials that has been done, and we looked at it. And we see that these patients, especially more recent treatment with, Barry mentioned quite a few of them in that part, including cladribines of the world and B-cell inhibitors of the world, which we have 3 of them right now, as mentioned. But I remember there was a medication that was probably one of the higher efficacy medication that started. Unfortunately, it's not in the market anymore. Mine was Antron. When
We used to use a lot of it.
Mitoxantrone originally came out in the market, which was in early 2000, that drug was the God-given gift to MS for a certain time. At the same time, it notes that to be an atomic bomb of immunology also, to the point that it made a lot of issues. But because of the fact that we were controlling the immune system, both B cells and T cells, so aggressively and so early, you would never see relapses. You never saw progression of the disease. The reason we're not using it is because of the risk and side effects, obviously, especially more than anything is the risk of the cardiac issues that was pulled out. But analytically, when you think about it, it's the same thing with with Lantrada, with the Tysabris of the world, with all the B cell inhibitors that we have and the Mavenclad. They do provide that hit on and sustain, hopefully, stability for these patients.
Anything you want to add, Barry?
No, I think you really nailed it down in terms of what we're really trying to achieve. There is a couple big clinical trials that are going to be looking at this. The ones Deliver MS and ones Treat MS, where people get randomized to this, starting with something not as robust in terms of power, but very safe, and then moving up, versus starting people on high efficacy treatment early. I think the biggest database that helps me out is something called it's MS Base, which is a global registry, and the Swedish registry. This data was pulled together, and it looked at who started on high efficacy treatment early and who delayed, and it was dramatically different that the people that got started on high efficacy treatment early were less likely to have disability. A small percentage of them got worse compared to the people where you delayed treatment, by 4 to 6 years and started later. So really, we try to do that in the clinic. Have a discussion. Let's just shut down the inflammation right away at the beginning. I think the other thing that's kind of missing is, I think back in the day, we didn't really focus on cognition that much with MS, which is like your ability to find words, your short-term memory, your ability to multitask at work. And I think we really didn't focus as much on cognition. And a lot of patients, as they age, when they're not treated well enough and strong enough, they start to have these cognitive problems in their 50s and 60s and may have to pull out of the workforce early. And so I think when we understand that a high efficacy treatment is not just to keep you out of a wheelchair, but it's also to keep your brain functioning so you can age well and be independent and continue to do your whatever you love to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's switch gears and let's talk about what's on the horizon. So we spent kind of the first half talking about where we've come from. Now let's talk about where we're going. So a couple of different therapies or theories that have been on the horizon, and I'll let Dan take one and Barry take one, and then we'll talk about the others together. But BTK inhibitors. So this has been a really hot topic. We've been talking a lot about smoldering MS, inflammation in the brain that's independent of what we see in the peripheral part of the body. When we know that most of our medications target inflammation in the peripheral part of the body, but don't necessarily get into the brain space or the CNS. And so let's talk about we definitely had one trial that reported out that was very disappointing, but we certainly have other medications in that same family that are still undergoing clinical trials. So where are we with BTK inhibitors?
That's actually a great segment to go to. So let's tell your audience a little bit about BTK.
Yeah.
So BTK stands for Berthine tyrosine kinase. So Berthine is a little gland in the back of the head, which basically is one of the hallmark of basically T cell maturation and B cell activation. That part of it, a majority of the B cells actually originate in part of it, that from bone marrow to that and matures and comes out. So beta-carotene kinase is one of the old. It's not a new thing that we know. It's probably one of the most regulatory receptors in the body that controls a lot of the immune milieus, in the sense that activation and communication between multiple cells within the body take place through the Berthine tyrosine kinase. And there are plethora of subtypes of it, as we know. Some of them soluble, some of them non-soluble, some of them reversible, some of them not. And hence, quite a few of the manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, basically run in the bandwagon of doing clinical trial on BTK, thinking this mechanism of action that basically controls the regulatory controllers of the immune cells, it's going to be beneficial, which in reality, as immunologists, we believe it does. However, the way that is going to work it still needs to be understood when it comes in the world of multiple sclerosis and neuroimmunology, and that part still being discovered. And as you mentioned, there have been multiple companies doing, and one of them, unfortunately, the phase 3 clinical data did not the primary endpoint into that, which we can discuss and talk why or not. And but I personally believe the roles of the BTK is much higher than controlling the relapse, which was one of the
Mm.
primary endpoints that they had in the clinical trial. I believe looking at three elements that recently have been introduced into the world of MS, and it's important for your audience to also see that because they're going to hear about it all the time through the journals and stuff. One is the concept of PIRA, progression independent of the relapses, for example, and the concept of RAW, which is a relapse-associated worsening. And then lastly, you mentioned, which I think it's worth talking about, is the smoldering MS. So all of these three elements, the end product of it is some sort of a damage or progression within the neurology and within the brain and spinal cord in that part of it. So the concept of the BTK being one of the receptors that participates in all of these three elements, including the smoldering MS, by controlling those receptors, by controlling or inhibiting those receptors, which, by the way, sits on majority of the immune cells. You look at the natural killer cells, you look at the B cells, and especially T cells. And more than anything else, recently we have discovered the macrophages and monocytes, which I call them bulldozers of the immune system, basically, do also have receptors, which basically can be affecting the signaling pathway. So the thought process behind the class of the medication is by inhibiting these receptors, you interrupting the signaling pathway of some of these negatively regulatory cells within the body. And therefore, you're able to control the degree of the subterranean damage that takes place within the immune system, and therefore reducing the progression of the disease, reducing relapse and MRI activities. The concept of the smoldering MS, which has been engulfing the world of multiple sclerosis these past year or so, is very intriguing and interesting. Why? Because for years we always pondered, we all have seen patients in the clinic that they really have been doing great. They've been taking their medication, they've been fully compliant, and they really have not had much of an activities when it comes into it, either clinically or radiologically, no new MRI lesion. And yet the patient would say, well, doctor, I know I'm progressing. My
Mm.
walking is getting worse. My cognition is getting worse, and all of those. And our answer was, well, MS is a progressive disease. But now we're realizing, yes, it is a progressive disease, but albeit to that, there is an underlying cause of it. And I love the terminology of a smoldering MS because it always reminds me of a big fire that has happened, and the fire department came and put the entire fire out, and yet there's this ambers sitting under the ash that anytime wind blows, this amber can engulf and start causing the damage. So
Mhm.
the concept of smoldering MS is something that I believe it has existed, but we never paid enough attention to it to be able to control. So the hope is by being able to regulate the regulatory cells, if that makes sense, within the immune system, including B cells and T cells, especially because it affects both of them, mainly B cells, and macrophages and monocyte, we're able to suppress the degree of the injury that takes place to both myelin and eventually to the axon, and provide
Mhm.
certain degree, I may use the word, protection into that part of it that it comes, and also control the disease. Now, where the efficacy of the BTK molecule stands, from the clinical trial that they have done, most of them, they have presented their phase 2 clinical trials in the national meetings and stuff. The efficacy has been good, relatively high, basically, not in the superior 90-95%, but when it comes to annualized rates of reduction of 79 to 82%, that's actually pretty good, and also control. That one particular molecule obviously did not meet their primary endpoint, but there are at least two other molecules that we're going to be presenting their clinical data,
Mhm.
hopefully within the next 4 to 5 months, maybe by the next ECTRO meeting. And the hope is that at least they show their primary endpoints have been met. So hopefully, eventually, this will become available to patients.
Yeah. What about progressive MS, Barry? What's on the horizon? So we're talking about, there are lots of different things at play, So I agree with Dan that, we've known about this concept of, MS progressing, even though we're doing the best we can to affect relapses. I think part of the reason we couldn't pay as much attention to it was because we were so busy trying to control the relapses. But now that we got the relapses and the GAD lesions under control, now we're looking at people like, oh my God, what are we going to do about this worsening? So what's on the horizon or what's in the back pocket to try to address progression?
Yeah, I mean, I think really the biggest hope is the BTK inhibitors, and I've been involved in clinical trials looking at progressive disease, and there's trials going on right now on both secondary progressive, so people that are slowly getting worse over time without new MRI activity or new relapses, which we call non-active secondary progressive disease, as well as primary progressive patients. And there's 2 of the BTKs that are being studied in that. So we should have the data and hopefully by ECTRIMS this year, if this class of medications, but this is the one that's the furthest along. There have been some approaches of taking T cells and knocking out B cells that are infected with Epstein-Barr virus, kind of designer T cells that knock out B cells that are infected with Epstein-Barr virus, and progressive patients it hasn't panned out. But there's other approaches. I think the other hot area that that I think we need to make some more progress on is remyelination. I've done 5 trials on repairing the damage that's done with MS at our center, but unfortunately, these haven't panned out. And most of these have been antibody therapies. So where you take an antibody, the problem is these antibodies don't get in high concentration in the brain and spinal cord. There's a barrier called a blood-brain barrier that sometimes prevents these antibodies getting in a high concentration. But there are ACTRIMS are meeting earlier this year. There's 3 compounds that are moving forward from animal models into the clinic. And hopefully these are molecules that will get in high concentration in the brain and spinal cord. So hopefully we can turn these cells on. 5 to 8% of the cells in the brain and spinal cord are immature myelin-making cells. So if we can turn them on and take out the inhibitory factors, perhaps we can repair the damage that's been done. So I think that's still doable, but it needs some investment. So I think that's going to be important. There are other compounds being looked at for progressive disease, but a lot of them are in earlier phases of clinical trials. But hopefully, we're going to make some more progress on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. And what about stem cells? Where are we with stem cell therapy? I still get that just about at least once or twice a month. Where are we with stem cells? They're all kinds of
more like that.
I'm being generous. But yeah, I get questions about stem cells all the time, and we know that there are stem cells, and then there are stem cells. So let's talk about kind of where we are with the state of stem cell transplant. And I try to make sure that when I talk to patients about therapy, that I am talking to them about stem cell transplant, which is the same procedure that we use for cancers, et cetera. Not necessarily stem cells where somebody does a little liposuction on you and takes some stem cells and gives them back to you. So let's talk a little bit about kind of where we are with that.
So it's great that you basically brought up segments of we have stem cells and we have stem cells. So this is probably one of the most important part of it, because to our audiences, they use the word stem cell quite better on the same line when it comes into it. So we started doing a stem cell project at USC almost about 30 years ago, and we're looking at basically 2 or 3 different concepts of the stem cells. So one of the most common type of stem cell that has been used basically in oncology for treatment of the cancers, especially stage 4 breast cancer and some of the others, and now is also in the past 12, 15 years have been used in MS, is called autologous stem cell transplant, which means that you basically are the donor for yourself. They extract a stem cell out of the bone marrow of you as a patient, and they preserve it, they filterize it, try to get rid of all the negative antigens in that part and antibodies. And then they give you massive dose of chemotherapy medications in the hospital, in the controlled environment or quarantine, and they kill your entire bone marrow, basically. And after that, they give the filterized stem cell or the bone marrow that they have taken from you, they give it back to you, hoping that basically the revitalizations of this stem cell that they give you, it regenerates and start generating multiple new cells, which are not going to be as aggressive as you had before. So that is called autologous stem cell, which it is probably a project that has had the longest period of right now going on. And every year at the ACTRIM and the meeting, there have been responses that, or the progress that has been reported. And so far, far few patients have been involved into that clinical trial. And probably one of the biggest issues with that is the number of the patients that have been in these trials collectively. And still, there are things to be learned about that.
Mm-hmm.
The other subtype of true stem cell is what you call mesenchymal stem cells, which are some of the things that you extract from other tissues or other organ donors or other people, and they filterize them and put them back in your body to the sense that with a similar process, eradicate the bone marrow through the chemotherapy, which, by the way, carries a higher risk of mortality into that.
Mm-hmm.
And with mesenchymal stem cells, similarly, you're hoping that you're able to regenerate not only the progenitor cells or the cells that are early part of the immune system, but also be able to regenerate some of the axonal or damaged nerve that you have, which has been going on in the laboratories right now. Unfortunately, most of these are not ready for prime time in the clinic or in the hospitals. But one of the other elements about the stem cell, which is really important and still controversial, is basically like a fetal transplant, stem cells from the fetuses and that kind of thing, which has shown does have such a great degree of the viable stem cells in order to provide repair. But of course, ethical, religious concept of the questions and controversy speaks for itself in that part, and depends on who's sitting in the White House. We're going to have a different elements for regulation for that also. But one
Yeah.
part of it that I do want to also touch upon, as you mentioned, is that we have a stem cell and we have a stem cells. I have patients who come to my office in Laguna Hills, and they tell me, and this is a true story, about 2 weeks ago, told me over the weekend I went to Tijuana and I got a stem cell. It's obviously about an hour and a half away from my office. And the story goes to the fact that there are doctors who actually go to Tijuana, Mexico, and they have small back of the gas station clinic kind of thing, and they give what I call kamikaze stem cells. And
Mm-hmm.
these are not just adipose or liposuction coming on. No, these are doctors who basically bribe the janitors in the hospital to get the placenta of the female patients,
Mm-hmm.
and they grind the placenta or the umbilical cord and they give it to the patients as a point of injection. They charge 20, 30, 50, $100,000 for each of those. And the patients most likely end up in the ICU or in the hospital with massive infections that we have had.
Mm-hmm.
So my cautionary advice to all of
Mm-hmm.
your audience that I have given to my also all the patients who have asked is that educate yourself,
Absolutely.
research, and find out what it is about. Because just because it's given in the clinic by a doctor someplace, that does not mean it's been regulated. And that regulation
Absolutely.
part of it is instrumentally important for your well-being.
Absolutely. Well, this conversation has been amazing. You know, I can talk to you guys for like hours, but our time is winding up. And so before we end, I want to ask two questions. One is, what are you excited about? I'll start with Barry. And the second is, do you think there'll be a role for combination therapy in MS? So, neurologists tend to be a little bit conservative, but our rheumatology colleagues, our oncology colleagues, they use all kind of stuff, mix all kind of stuff together. And I remember way back in the day where we used to add a little oral immunosuppressant to some of our injectables if we wanted to try to get a little extra bang for our buck. So I'll ask those two questions and then we'll wrap up. I'll start with you, Barry. What are you excited about, and what do you think about combination therapy?
Yeah, I think the next generation treatment is gonna be even more targeted. So one of the things that's out there is called CAR T. And so what this is you're creating designer T cells. Basically, you take T cells out of your body, you're genetically re-engineering them so they can target specific B cells in the body. And with these monoclonal antibodies like B cell therapies, like Ocrevus and Kesimpta, Briumvi, the antibody again doesn't get into the nervous system very well, and we know there's B cells hanging out that can cause progressive disease. There's these clusters of B cells and under the coverings of the brain that we got to get to. So these new very targeted T cells, like with CAR T, they're going to get in and actually go after specific targets. So we're going to get a lot more finessed. There's other approaches that may not necessarily deplete the B cells, but make B cells inactive. So there's other ways that we may be able to target the immune system even better. And I think in terms of combination therapy, I think it's really, I don't know if we need more immunosuppressive approaches. I think we need something that's going to work against the neurodegeneration. How do we protect that precious neuron and axon from degenerating? How do we find a remyelination compound that we can add. So I like to see combination coming at it different approaches, not just trying to knock down people's immune systems even more than we already are.
Absolutely. All right. I'll give you the last word, Dan.
So I think Barry eloquently put all of those things. So I believe, again, as far as excitement for the new generation, the BTK CAR T, and there's also another new class of drugs that's going to be start being researched on. They already have done some of the phase 2, and that is anti-CD40 ligand, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, anti-IL-6 uh, monoclonal antibodies, which hopefully are going to work exactly on what we are talking about, be able to penetrate through this, blood-brain barrier, through the central nervous system, controlling not only the lesions in the brain, but also it has such an affinity for spinal cord, which for years we know that caused majority of the progression and disability in this patient. So I'm very excited about all of those things, as well as, not to diminish, I'm still excited about the good stem cell project, looking at neurotrophin factors, BDNF, GDNF, some of these molecules that can help us be able to regenerate some of these nerves, that which we have done clinical trial in the past, unfortunately, like oxinumab, it didn't pan out to work in that. And that links it to your second question, is that most of these molecules hopefully going to be able to be used in the combination therapy. But once again, as Barry was mentioning, there's no point of giving two T cell inhibitors and suppress the immune system double in that part and see how much infection the patient can get. No. I think what we need to do, use a complementary element into it. Whatever we're missing from the mechanism of action that one drug is not doing, try to add something to it. But the future of MS, same as the future or the current of epilepsy, for example, or some of the other neurological disorder, that if one medication doesn't control the seizure, you add a second agent to it. We definitely need to be in that part also, that finding good complementary treatment into that. Two medication that have two different mechanisms of action, that one complements the other one, fulfill the need for the other one, will definitely give us what we would call virtual cure in that part. When you control the disease at 100%, you are living your normal life into that part of it. And I think that's what's going to make a big difference in the future, and we're hopeful to that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very excited about all the amazing things we've talked about. I'm sure our audience is as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Bhandari. Thank you, Dr. Singer, for your time. And thank you to everyone for tuning in to Brain Chat. We will see you again in 2 weeks' time.